Hey everyone, welcome to our podcast, the Rewind Podcast. I have the pleasure of inviting and speaking to Ryan Smith from TruDiagnostics. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. It's good to be back.
Listen, great to have you. Are you ready to give a lesson 101 on epigenetic testing?
Yeah, try my best. It's a complex topic, but really exciting application. So we'll try and break it down.
Awesome. So listen, can you give us a quick high level, what is an epigenetic test? What's the purpose? And we'll start from there.
Yeah, certainly. And first and foremost, I hope people can get excited about this because it's sort of a new level of I would say diagnostics, a new level of data that we can get from our body. The way I typically explain epigenetics is this idea that, every single cell in our body has the exact same DNA. So if we were to get a saliva sample or a hair sample, we'd see this exact same sequence for you that is really, really unique to you and it can tell you what your body is meant to do. But obviously those cell types have very different outcomes, right? Our skin cells behave like skin cells while our heart cells behave like heart cells. And the way that they're able to have the same DNA, but to have different essentially actions within the body is by what DNA is actually turned on and turned off. And the way that those DNA is regulated is by epigenetic regulation. So epigenetics is essentially those on or off switches for the DNA, which allow our cells to behave the way they should, to act the way they should, and ultimately give our body the outcomes and phenotypes that make us who we are. And this is really, really exciting because we've really just started to be able to interpret these on or off switches, and every single cell is different. So in terms of why you want to be able to read these, we can do a lot of things with this technology. What we're doing is essentially detecting age and being able to tell you a little bit about your aging process. We can go into that a little bit later, but this can be applied to any area of medicine. We can use this to essentially tell you when you might die, for instance, predict your death. We might be able to tell you how much you've smoked across an entire lifetime. We might be able to tell you if you're likely to lose weight with a certain intervention or if you're likely to have side effects with a certain medication. And so the amount of applications of this type of information is sort of limitless.
Great. So it sounds like it's almost like we have a personal video recorder following us around for our entire life. And then this is tracking the totality of all of the things that we've done within our life from a cellular level, I assume.
Absolutely. So these instructions, these on or off switches, give your body the necessary information to do what it's supposed to do. But in addition to that, again, as you mentioned, the exposures we have throughout our life, even what we're eating or what we might be doing on a sort of a day-to-day basis is affecting these epigenetic values. And so it is a log, but it's also, I would say, something that's changeable. And that's really one of the major features and benefits of this is that you can sort of read out what is happening, but then you can also make differences to change those outcomes and really take control of your own health. We always like to say you're not your DNA, right? You can actually change its expression and then sort of affect the outcomes you really want to affect.
Great. So long term, we'll have a strategy to try to positively impact the areas where we need help, and then I assume extend our life if we make the appropriate changes.
Certainly, and that's what we measure. Ultimately, is this idea of measuring your biological age or how old your body is, and that can be helpful in a lot of ways because aging is the biggest risk factor for almost all chronic disease and death. And so, it's definitely something we want to quantify so we can make the proper changes, make you younger, and then reduce your risk of every chronic disease. But you can do this even, for instance, with smoking. Whenever you smoke, you can actually change epigenetic regulation of certain places in your DNA. And obviously, we know smoking is not good for you. And one of the things we want to do is change that location of methylation. And so you can apply this for a lot of ways to improve health, everything from improving fitness to improving your IQ and mental processing speeds to improving your longevity, which is ultimately what we're measuring and applying this for.
Excellent. Next question. What is DNA methylation and why is it so important to your health?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, these are providing the codes for exactly what your DNA should be doing, what these cells should be doing. And so, the DNA provides what I call the blueprint. But this in order to actually make any sort of actionable change in your body, it's happening through the expression or regulation of what genes are turned on, and therefore what proteins are encoded and how the body is actually functioning. And so this is important for every cell type. It tells your skin how to behave and, improves, for instance, your wrinkles if we wanted to. We can make certain changes to make sure you have less wrinkles or less photo aging. Or we could, make it so your muscles generally lose less tissue over age and you don't have as much frailty with age. And so, these I should say these codes or these signalings are important for every process that happens in your body, and dysregulation of those processes are what cause eventually these diseases to develop. And so, but for us, we're really looking at epigenetic methylation as the main marker here. And epigenetic methylation is essentially a silencing of gene transcription. So it's that off switch, so to speak. So it's sort of when genes are turned off, we'll see methylation at higher levels. And that can tell us, again, if something's abnormal or if something is, sort of where it should be, or if it's something that we want to change. And so that's really what we're quantifying. We measure right around 900,000 locations in your genome. And at each location, we're essentially getting a number, a percentage between 0 and 1. And then we're looking at how often is that particular location methylated in your blood. And with that information, we're able to develop these algorithms to be able to interpret that output into clinical features. And so, as I mentioned, we might use these computer learning derived algorithms to predict death. We might use it to predict, your VO2 max in terms of how, fit you are. We might be able to do it to tell you, how your immune system is functioning. And so we can do a lot of different things with this data because it's so complex. But methylation is really the way that we're doing it, by looking at how those genes are turned off.
Great. So it sounds like we have a bunch of off and on switches. Some are good, some are bad. And the key to longer term health is to try to figure out which ones are beneficial to be turned on, which ones are beneficial to be turned off, and then take appropriate action to make those switches switch the right way.
Exactly, and I always like to say, use the analogy of the Rosetta Stone, right? The Rosetta Stone was, a great tool to be able to help interpret a new language, and that's exactly what we're doing here at TruDiagnostics is trying to develop the Rosetta Stone of how to interpret these methylation marks. And as you mentioned, methylation is not always good; it's not always bad. In order to see those associations, we really have to look at how these marks associate with outcomes. So we might look at, for instance, disease-related outcomes. Maybe methylation in one spot's great to prevent cardiovascular disease, but in another, we might see that it actually leads to worse outcomes of cardiovascular disease. And so we're really just learning how to read that DNA patterns to be able to tell you what's currently happening in your life. And with that, we can get incredibly specific. And because these things are temporal, or they change in time, it can really tell us, both the history, but also what's currently happening now. And so by comparing those two things, we can sort of say, hey, here's where you've been, here's where you're going, and here's how we change it.
Right. And then I think this is a valuable service because as the data set grows and as you get more and more of that and aggregate it and figure out more complex algorithms, there's more value in all of that data.
Absolutely. And I think some of our clients have even seen this already. Whenever we first rolled out our testing about 2 years ago, we only had one output, which was, what is your body's age? How old is your body aging? And this is a very important thing because, we all know people in their 50s who look like they're 70, and we all know people in their 70 who look like they're 50. And this is called phenotypic variation. And, chronological age doesn't capture that difference, right? But we can see it. And so we really need something to measure the biology of that process, right? Something that can sort of tell us why we're seeing those differences. And so that's what we developed, at least initially, is this idea of biological aging. And it's a concept which is really changing the way that we look at age, which is already, even chronological age, is the number one biggest risk factor. But so whenever we first rolled out, we just had that one report. But now we have over 11 or 12 that have been added to any of our patients who take our tests because we're able to analyze that data in more complex ways. And we'll continue to add reports just about every 4 to 6 weeks. And so now, in addition to that overall biological age, we can tell you things like your immune age and all of, what types of immune cells you have and at what percentage. We can tell you things like your telomere length, which previously used to be sort of the best biomarker for aging, which now these markers definitively beat. We can tell you even right now how fast is your pace of aging. So at the moment that we take the test, what is sort of your speedometer of aging at this exact moment? We can tell you how many stem cell divisions you're having per year. We can tell you what your current level of drinking is, if you're a current, former, or never smoker. And all of these things are included in our reports, and they weren't even just 2 years ago. And so the amount of information is it's a little bit like Moore's law, where we see, we might look back at, some of those computer chips in the 80s, and now we can do it with just, even flash drives that are, half the size of your thumbnail. It's very similar to the gains that we're seeing in being able to interpret biological data. Now that we have computer learning and these ways to really see patterns in ways we haven't before, the amount of information we can pull from the same data set is growing at an exponential rate. And this is affecting all areas of medicine, as I mentioned, but definitely aging. And that's really, I think, something that we've been trying to fight for, is viewing this idea of aging as a disease.
Yeah, it's great. And I think it's also will impact quality of life. We live in a society now where I've seen so many of my people my parents' age, they started having, I'm 52, they started having problems in their 50s. And then it's a real sort of gradual downhill slide with more and more physical ailments encountered over time. Whereas if we could address that and avoid that and hopefully, have another 20, 30 really good years where we're very healthy, that's where the data I think would be really beneficial.
You're exactly right. And I think that that's an important thing to mention because a lot of people think about longevity. They think, why would I want to live another 10 years if I'm going to live in a nursing home and, someone's going to have to wait on me and I'm going to be miserable. And I always like to say that those things are not mutually exclusive. If you're treating aging as a process, you actually improve all of those quality of life measurements. And we have some really good pictures that show this. We can even see that the rate of aging, that pace of aging I mentioned, is correlated to how much muscle mass you have. It's correlated to how your IQ. It's correlated to the ability to balance. It's correlated to even your facial aging. So even the way you look and move about the world and the way that you even are able to think about the world is all affected by this fundamental process we call aging. And so they're not mutually exclusive. If you're improving your aging rates, not only are you making your life longer, you're making your life better from a quality of life standpoint. And that's exactly what you want to see because unfortunately we have a little bit of a health span problem here in the United States. We might be seeing, our ages or the average age of death get a little bit older, but we're actually seeing that time that we spend sick significantly widening. And the fact is that aging treats both of those. If you can treat aging as the primary cause and driver, then you're essentially finding solutions for both quality of life, health span, and lifespan.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had your test taken, so I'm excited to go over the results. We'll probably do that in another podcast. But so please explain, like, how does the TruAge test work? Like the basic one. I know there are 12 reports now. What does it measure? And then, like what insights, action items are we going to get out of that once the results come back in?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that in order to understand how to use those results, it might be helpful to go into sort of how this test was created, at least originally. Because at first, it wasn't necessarily developed as a health marker. It was used almost as, I would say, a novelty trick, where they sort of created this clock to predict someone's chronological age. And they were using this originally at things like, crime scenes to see how old someone was if they left their DNA at a crime scene for forensic analysis. And they were also using it for Syrian refugees, where, for instance, those people who were coming to asylum in these European countries, if they were minors, they would be let into the country, but if they were adults, they probably wouldn't. And so what they were sort of looking at is, are these people adults or minors, and making sure that they weren't lying about their age. And so it was used in these ways initially after it sort of was created in 2013, but very soon they started to realize a pattern, which is that those people who were older than their chronological age with this testing were at significantly more increased risk for these outcomes. And those people who were younger than their chronological age were at improved outcomes. And one of my favorite statistics is that if everyone in the world were to be 7 years younger, we'd be able to cut disease in half immediately. You'd have a 50% reduction in morbidity and mortality. And so this can make a major, major impact. And so that's when they started to realize that this measurement of the biological aging process is absolutely fundamental to everything that relates to our health. And so with this testing, that's essentially what we're looking at. We're looking at how old is your body, and are you accelerated or are you a decelerated aging? And then once we get that baseline, now we have an objective way to measure if we can reverse or slow that process. And so what we try and do is to find out what interventions are the best, both in the population, but also in the individual. To see, what things we might recommend. And there are a lot of things we've learned from this process. A lot of things we know epidemiologically are things that we probably already know, right? Optimizing sleep, right? Having a nutritious diet. Some of those really, I would say no-brainer type things. But this is a way to see how well you're doing on a personal basis even. Are you really accomplishing all those things like you should? And sort of what is your risk from the biggest risk factor of all of these things? And so that's fundamentally what we're looking at. It is what is your aging process, and then finding the ways that really work for you to reverse that aging process.
Right. By the way, I believe that I'm aging at 0.89 of a year, which is not terrible. I mean, it's better than one. But what's the record? Do you have a record, or what am I shooting for?
Yeah, so we do have a record, and it's right around zero point 0.6 biological years per year. That is essentially the upper threshold, and that score is great. But really, what you want to do, I should mention, is to have that as low as possible. And the lower that you get that, the better. So those people who are actually fast agers have significantly worse outcomes. On average, they can be up to 65% more likely to die than those individuals who are at normal or slow aging. And so this can make a huge impact. And as I mentioned, it's correlated to even how many wrinkles you have. It's correlated to your IQ. It's correlated to all of these metrics of quality of life. And so that is our favorite of all of the metrics, that instantaneous marker, because it tells you at this exact moment, are the things that you're doing in your life good, to protect you from these things in the long term. And so for that 0.89 is actually not a bad score. As we get older, it's harder to keep that below 1. But even if we're slightly above 1, so that means we're aging at maybe a 1.01 biological years per year. So for every year chronologically, you're aging 1.01 biologically. You'd actually increase your risk of death over the next 7 years by 56%, and you'd increase your risk of a chronic disease diagnosis by 54%. And so keeping that below 1 is definitively the goal there. But the lower that we can get it, the better, because we'll just have even better outcomes.
Yeah, my goal is to get to zero point 0.6, because then if I had another 30 years to live, I would now extend it to another 50, basically.
Well, yes, I mean, definitely. We looked at a 15-year follow-up cohort, and the people who were slow agers were, and zero point 0.6 is definitively slow aging, no matter how old you are. If those people who were in that cohort were on average, were over 15 years, maybe had a 9 to 10% death rate, whereas those people who were fast agers had over 60% death rate. And so again, if you want to reduce that risk, the best thing you can do is to fix the fundamental process and the biggest risk factor, which is the aging process.
Right. We just were talking about statistics, so this is sort of redundant, but do you have quick, key statistics that, can convince or help people understand what's the benefit of running the test? So I had a question in my own mind, which is, if I had a lower epigenetic age than, let's say, my, chronological age, is there a certain metric that tells me I might be less likely to pass away this year, next year, 10 years out, versus someone who has the, epigenetic versus equal to their chronologic?
Yeah, so certainly. And the issue, though, is, as you mentioned, there have been a lot of variety of these algorithms. And so there's actually been some algorithms created directly for death prediction that are very, very accurate and can really even predict death, within a period of 6 or 7 years. We're actually working on one right now that we think is probably going to be the most accurate. So we can really address longevity, and then separately even address risk of disease, and then separately even address those quality of life related metrics. And I think that, even some of those facial aging pictures, I would love to throw some up here, just to sort of even show you what that looks like on the faces of individuals. It's some of the best proof, but each algorithm is a little bit different. So it depends, the differences in that, lifespan depend on probably what algorithm you're using. But one of the other big and important features here is that we can not just connect this to lifespan, we can actually connect it to individual diseases. So let's say that, for instance, you have a history of breast cancer in your family, and you want to see, what is my aging rate doing to increase my risk of breast cancer? We can actually tie it directly to that. We can tie it to, peripheral artery disease, or we can tie it to lung cancer, or we can tie it to diabetes or Alzheimer's. Any of these conditions, we can actually tell you how you're increasing or decreasing your rate as a result of some of these individual statistics. And so because age is the biggest risk factor for all of those conditions, we can really predict if your risk is increasing or decreasing. And so again, for us, that target marker is to make people slow agers, which is generally, I would say, being in the top, or I should say the lowest 40% of aging. And then in addition to that, making sure your biological age is 7 years younger, because that's where we have that 50% reduction. And that is going to correspond to, several years in life extension. So again, it connects to every disease, it connects to lifespan. And that's just why it's so important. And that's why people like the World Health Organization are now classifying this as, a disease in and of itself.
So if I'm 7 years younger epigenetically than my biological age, I'm 50% less likely to die than the average 50-year-old. Did I get it right?
Yes, absolutely. And again, that risk changes as you get older, right? But you're always going to be 50% less likely than the average person your age.
So if I was 80 and my statistical chance of dying at 80 was 20%, I would then be 50% less likely to die than the average 80-year-old, correct?
Correct, and that would put your total risk at right around 10%, right? Which is 20%. And again, we can do the same with sort of lifespan extension. If someone's projected to live another 10 years, you would probably even double that as well.
By the way, I've seen the picture with the aging differences for the face. If you have it and can do a screen share, that's great. If not, forward me the slide and I'll just plug it into the video so everyone could see, because I think it's really amazing.
Yeah, certainly. I would love to show it because it really is visual proof, I think, of why that's so important. And so if you don't mind, I'll try and pull it up here as we speak. But it's a great way to just see that and really understand why this process is happening. And I always tell people, once you see it, people are like, why should I'm doing Botox, but should I? And the answer is yes. Continue to do all those things which help fix the features, but you also want to fix the underlying cause. And that's one of the best things about this is you can really fix the underlying cause and then also try and treat symptoms.
I saw it. By the way, we help. So I'll tell you, like personally, we help a lot of clients that are middle aged that are trying to get in shape, and we help them get in much better, physical shape. So I'll have some people that will come to us obese, 35% body fat. We get them down to 15% body fat, amazing transformation. But one of the most amazing aspects is how much their faces change and how much the health and the way that they look changes. And I think it's a really, big indication of how much, being unhealthy does impact physical appearance.
Definitely. And I don't have permission to share, but if you want to throw that over to me, I'll absolutely show it up on the screen. And I'll also show you the differences, not just in, sort of the facial aging, but even the muscle mass and cognitive decline and grip strength and balance and walking speed and all of these different things that impact this process.
I think because it's my Zoom, I'm the one who can share. So what I'll do is you'll send me the image, and then I'll paste it into the video once we post it out there, because I think it's important for people to see that, especially in today's world. Like you said, Botox, people are doing a lot of aesthetics. They're still going to continue to do that, but to the extent that you can start to help from a inside out perspective, I think is amazing.
Exactly, and there are multiple analogies for that, right? You can put a fresh paint, on your car, but you also want to fix, right, the thing that might be, causing the paint to deteriorate, right? Put it in a garage, protect it from some of those causes, right? Exactly. And a combination of both of those is really what is going to maximize, all your efforts.
Well, you can repaint a car, but you can't change the engine could still be, stalled out, or the battery could be dead. Based on the research that you guys have, do you have some sort of leading changes that people can make in their lives, like ones that are most commonly identified areas to improve?
Certainly, and there, as I mentioned, there are a lot of things that are very intuitive. Right, getting the right amount of sleep, right, eating a nutritious diet. Those things are things you probably already know. There's some interesting things that we found out that maybe go against some of those classical assumptions. One of the things we've seen is in a lot of our professional and Olympic athletes, they tend to have significantly worse aging than we would anticipate, right? And that might be because they're exercising too much, putting their body under too much stress, which I think has been an interesting finding. Some of the other things that we really have found that have been surprising to us is the impact of stress. Stress and the ability to even regulate your emotions can actually play a major difference in your aging process. And so that's one of the things we always try and target, and it works for everyone. If people can reduce their levels of perceived stress, so even just the stress you're feeling on a day-to-day basis that you score yourself, it's something that's completely subjective. It can make a major impact to these aging rates. So those are things I think we've always found a little bit surprising. Is that there's a sweet spot for generally now everything. You don't want to overdo anything, you don't want to underdo everything. Moderation is key, but there are also some interventional things that we find that have some really good correlations, and one of the best ones tends to be fasting, caloric restriction, and that's been one of the, I would say, most well-validated therapies for interventions across most mammal species. But whenever we see people reduce their calories, their rates of aging can decrease. And we would anticipate that this would lead to obviously all of those other effects, like improved muscle mass, improved balance, improved mental processing, and even the facial aging. And so caloric restriction, although it might not be fun, is a process that definitively works across the board.
I think there's been some studies done also on intermittent fasting or intermittent mimicking fasting, which also has a similar anti-aging effect. I guess it's putting the body under stress so that it has to adapt and, sort of survive.
Exactly. And then, there are a lot of theories on why that might happen. This process of autophagy, where your body sort of is able to eat itself. It's a little bit like spring cleaning, right? Where your body's able to, repurpose a lot of the things that your body has created already and make it more efficient. And so autophagy is, one of those processes that might mitigate some of the effects we're seeing, with that life extension and caloric restriction. And so that's one area. But even things that you're probably doing in your clinic already, right? Doing things like optimal hormonal maintenance, doing things like, making sure that people are sensitive to insulin, or have low BMIs. Like, those are things that are all going to affect this marker, and help you keep it as low as possible for as long as possible.
Yeah, we drive a lot of health based on body fat percentage because we think that weight is such a poor metric for measuring health. Back to your professional athletes, in terms of aging faster, I was at a conference and there was someone giving a lecture that said athletes from a hormonal perspective often are like bright stars. They burn bright very fast, but they burn out very fast. And there's a significant, hormonal decline, which is much greater than the average person. So they have really high, great hormone levels when they're young, which allows them to compete at a very high level. But then their levels decline faster, and then they get into poor health. And you can see how many former professional athletes end up being very out of shape.
Exactly. And you see this even with, obviously the sex hormones that we all talk about all the time, but even things like adrenal hormones, right? With, some of those stress hormones we mentioned, right? Like cortisol. Yeah. And it's the exact same. And we already talked about the impact of stress, right? Stress, even emotional stress, but even physical stress, right, can deplete some of those hormones, get you a little bit out of balance, which is why it's so important to test those. One of the biggest issues currently with these epigenetic ages can absolutely tell you where you're at with the biggest risk factor, but it doesn't necessarily always tell you what's driving that for you. Right. So for these athletes, we might say, hey, it's probably, some of this, this high levels of stress. It might be reactive oxygen species. It might be these hormone, changes. But we're not really able to point to a specific reason. And that's why you have to view it in a larger medical context. You can say, hey, this is the biggest risk factor and this is what we want to manage. But there are probably other things specific to you as an individual that might be driving that process. And so it is still an integrative health approach. It's another piece of general medical care, but it's a very, very important and very big I would say process that you want to fix and resolve.
Great. I have another question, which is somewhat related. So what is cellular senescence and why is it so important?
Yeah, definitely. So whenever we talk about aging, a lot of times the best way to classify aging is via what we call these hallmarks of aging. And cellular senescence is definitively one of those hallmarks. Some people might call cellular senescence sort of zombie cells. I don't love that term, but essentially what these cells are cells that essentially pause. And these cells might pause for a variety of reasons. But essentially they stay alive, but they don't necessarily replicate. So they're just sort of in this suspended stage. And when they're in this stage, they don't function like they normally would. One of the biggest changes is that they start to create a lot of inflammation. And as most people know, chronic inflammation is one of the worst things you can have for your body, not even just for aging, but even for disease. But they call this process inflammaging. And so that's a really negative process because as we get older, these cells start to accumulate into very high degrees. And so one of the biggest, I would say, anti-aging therapeutic interventions that people think are in development right now are ways to get rid of those cells, to make sure that they stop from just being suspended and your body can sort of get rid of them. And autophagy, as we mentioned, sort of those periods of fasting is one of the ways that people think you can do that by encouraging the body to break down its own cells to repurpose them for new fuel or new creation. And another way to do it is via these interventional drugs called senolytics. And by doing so, you can reduce a lot of different disease outcomes, things like osteoarthritis, even gray hair. And some of the studies they've done in mice, you can see these sort of old, frail, small mice, be treated with these products, and then all of a sudden they're more muscular. Their fur is now dark again. It's no longer gray. It's thicker. They have better vision. They have more energy, and so it can affect multiple levels in this process. But it's one of those hallmarks of aging is this accumulation of cells that we absolutely want to prevent. And if we can't prevent it, we definitely want to get rid of.
Yeah, by the way, I would love to have some of that natural product to get with the gray taken care of out of my hair. I'm getting some. Um, what about telomere length? So I hear a lot about telomere length, and what role does it play in all of this?
Yeah, so telomere length was one of the initial biomarkers of aging. One of the first things we were able to say this is correlated with the aging process, and it was exciting because theoretically it made a lot of sense. These telomeres are essentially the very ends of our DNA. And every time we replicate our DNA, so as our cells replicate, which is happening all the time in our body, billions of times per day, right? That we start to lose pieces of that DNA just because we can't always replicate the very last bit of it. And so what happens is our body, in order to not lose very important genetic information, puts these little end caps on our DNA where we're expected to lose that DNA. And those are what we call these telomeres. And so the problem, though, is that whenever we continue to replicate our cells, sometimes we actually lose all of those telomeres and we start to get into DNA which is really important. And sometimes to prevent that from sometimes that might cause negative outcomes. One of those is senescence, where the body says, we don't want to proliferate this DNA anymore because we're starting to lose important pieces of it. So let's pause it, right? And then you go to a senescent cell. And so that's called what we call this Hayflick limit. Whenever you finally reach that point. And so it can cause senescence, but it's been a biomarker of aging and been correlated to a lot of these negative outcomes. And so it's another one of those hallmarks. And so telomeres were what people were measuring before these epigenetic clocks came out. But these epigenetic clocks are really, I would say at this point, better at measuring the aging process than telomeres because they're more predictive of negative health outcomes. They're more correlated to negative health outcomes, and they're actually even more correlated to age, actually double the correlation to age than traditional telomere length testing. And so even with the tests that we do, we don't only we also even provide you the telomere length. So you can actually see where you're at there. And our version of telomere length is even better at predicting time till death, time to coronary heart disease, and time to congestive heart failure. And so it tends to be our marker of telomere length is even better than traditional telomere length. But that's also one of the things that we hopefully try and fix. There have been a lot of studies looking at, supplements which might increase telomere length, things that even nutritionally, like omega-3 fatty acids, have been shown to increase telomere length. So that's definitely a hallmark of aging. But right now, you can get all of that information from just these epigenetic clocks.
A question that I take personally for myself, right? So what is the benefit? Obviously, I ran the test. I'm excited to go over the results. But what is the benefit for like a 52-year-old guy, a middle-aged guy to run this test? It's going to give me some data, help me improve my health, or give me some caution if I'm aging too fast, right?
Yeah, definitely. The first thing you want to know is where am I at, right? If you're at extremely high risk, or I should say, if you're at extremely high aging rates, that puts you at extremely high risk for every other condition. And so to give you an example, I always like to use the case of cancer, right? Cancer is obviously feared for everyone. Everyone knows the type of impact that can have with a cancer diagnosis in your life. And for instance, every 1 year that you are older biologically than chronologically. So for instance, if you're, 52 years of age and you have a biological age that's 54, you would increase your risk of developing cancer over the next 3 years by 12%. And you'd increase your risk of dying of cancer over the next 5 years by 34%. And so the first question we want to ask is, where are we and what's our risk? And sometimes that can be a little bit scary. And so we don't want to make this scary, and it shouldn't be, because the idea is you can change this, right? But the first point of knowing where to go is to know where you're at. We always say you can't manage what you can't measure. And so now for the first time, we have a way to very accurately measure that biggest process, and then we can learn how to change it. And so the question you want to ask yourself, at least first, is where I'm at. And then the second question you want to ask yourself is, what do I need to do to fix that? And generally, we're going to ask that second question regardless. Even if you have a great rate of aging, there's no such thing as having too low of a metric, right? And so the lower we can get this, the better. And so we're always going to ask that second question no matter what. And for a lot of people, we might be able to also identify things that might be having a negative impact on their life. So you might be able to say, I'm doing all of these different things. I'm really health conscious, but some of those things might be having a negative effect that you don't quite realize. And this is a way to find out some of that. And so we're always going to trying to optimize, right? There's no such thing for us as being, too great at aging. And so we're always going to try and get it down, and we're going to hopefully identify the ways for you to do that.
Right. Excellent. How does having like optimized hormone levels and good health impact the scoring on the test? Is that going to be, let's say my average client is in better shape, so they should theoretically score better and have better, I guess, test results?
Yeah, certainly. And so there are a lot of factors which impact this, right? Everything from sleep to the amount of pollution you're exposed to the amount of stress you have, to your hormone levels, and your actual biological features, right? Like your amount of body fat, for instance. And so this is a really broad metric. It's capturing everything in your life, which might be increasing this aging rate. But we know that generally body mass is one of those biggest factors. And so having an optimal body mass, having an optimal diet are two incredibly important things, because that's generally your diet is what most of your exposures are, right? That's what's going into your body the majority of the time. And we know that, for instance, even things like hormone maintenance can make a major impact. We see this even with women, for instance, who go through menopause, who have rates of aging that can sort of accelerate rapidly after the process. And we even see this again with men who might have extremes of things like testosterone. If you have way too much or super physiological testosterone, that can increase your aging. Or if you have very, very little, we see that same aging association. So there is an optimal level of these things, and so everything in your life impacts it. But some of those things, like particularly, I would say, body composition, are one of the major things that can affect it.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the metrics that we obviously track really closely is body fat percentage, because we clearly don't want, our clients to be at an unhealthy body fat percentage. And, we see people that come in with much fewer injuries. Their knees feel better. They have better, cognitive function. And so when they drop weight and get in better shape, everything in life seems to be better, and they're just happier overall.
Yeah, definitely, and yeah, these things are directly related too, because we actually even know that things like, for instance, the age of onset of puberty is related to aging rates. We can actually, even at age 3, in some of the cohorts we've done, be able to predict the outcomes at age 45. And so, a lot of people think, hey, I need to start thinking about aging in my 40s or 50s or 60s, and the answer is, you're aging throughout your entire life. There's no time that's too early to try and improve that process, and it impacts all those other things. And so it's a cyclical relationship. You might say sometimes dysregulated hormones might cause increased aging, but you can also say the reverse. The dysregulated aging rates can change your hormone levels. And so these things are very intertwined, which is why it's such a big risk factor.
So when we do the test, we're obviously going to get, a report back, and that's going to an extent, give us a little bit of a roadmap to help us to improve the rate at which we're aging.
Mhm. Yeah, correct. And so we'll give general recommendations for everyone, and these are the things that we know, across the population are always effective, and those are some of those really intuitive things. But then we might make more specific recommendations. One of our reports goes to, are you likely to lose weight with caloric restriction? So for some people, they might reduce their calories and lose a ton of weight. Other people might reduce their calories the same exact amount and nothing happens. And that can be obviously very, very frustrating, but wouldn't you like to know up front if you're that person?
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. And so we can actually tell you, right, if you should probably just focus on diet, or if you're going to have to do other things. And some of those other things that we mentioned are things like thyroid optimization, or things like insulin sensitivity with the interventions like GLP-1 agonists, which I know you all do in your clinic. And so in addition to that, we might have to do a lot more metabolic rate increases by doing combinations of aerobic and anaerobic activity. And so you can actually get an idea of what you should do for each of these conditions. And so we won't just talk about aging, we'll even talk about some of those actual phenotypes of that you're trying to fix as well.
So that's at the genetic level then, that if I calorie restrict, something in my body has a survival mode, apparently, that I would not be losing weight as fast because my body will adjust metabolism faster than someone else?
Yeah, definitely. And we're not really sure, I would say, the precise mechanism, but we do know that it's highly predictive. And so we're actually looking at one gene called the PON3 gene. And generally, the more methylated that gene is, so the more it's turned off, the more you're likely to lose weight. Whereas if it's hypomethylated and sort of turned on more often, then that means you're less likely to lose weight with simple caloric restriction. And so we're able to find those associations and then be able to make recommendations. One of the other things we do, as I mentioned before, is we're able to tell you how much alcohol you're currently drinking. Are you drinking a moderate amount, a high amount, or a low amount? And alcohol even is another thing that, on average, heavy alcohol users have over a 3-year age increase versus those individuals who are drinking at a lower rate. And these things, again, are reversible, right, to some degree. And so the idea is you can really stop some of those behaviors, but use it as a way to keep yourself honest, too. You might say, try and make some reductions, look at your DNA, say, are those reductions helping? Not just in, alcohol intake, but in my overall age. And so we can actually even give you feedback on, how well you're applying some of these lifestyle-related recommendations.
I mean, I've seen people who drink, who are heavier drinkers really do age faster that I've known for 20 years. And I look at them compared to people who don't drink as much. And I think that the change is so dramatic and obvious that it's almost shocking. I never would have thought that, by the way, until you start to see cases.
Exactly. You sort of have to have the experience, because you don't necessarily see it when you're walking out on the street. You don't know, right?
Yeah.
But once you start to see it in patients you work with, or even close friends, and that's what we're seeing, is we have these objective data points where we're able to first see how much you're drinking and then correlate that to your aging process, and we see it to be definitively linked. Actually, a study was just published yesterday, which we first thought it was right around a 2.2-year increase. This newest data suggests it's over 3 years, and there are also been studies to say that maybe even a small amount is not necessarily a bad thing. And that goes back to things like this French paradox, where, the French might drink more, eat more saturated fats, have more carbohydrates, but they also might drink more wine, but that might even be protective to some degree. And so, we see that small amounts, maybe 1 to 2 drinks of beer or wine per week, tend to have positive age-related outputs. And so, again, now that we have a way to measure this process, we can find out what's changing it. And these information is coming at a rapid pace. To date, there have only been right around 10 trials which have looked at a baseline and then an intervention and then an outcome. But over these next few years, there are going to be hundreds. And one of my favorite developments in the space, actually the largest well-funded startup of all time by Jeff Bezos, just occurred. It's called the Altos Labs, and they're studying basically at the fundamental molecular level how to reverse aging of cells. So how to reset these epigenetic clocks back to zero. And when they do that, it's accompanied with all of these benefits. Particularly, they've even been able to restore vision in mice who have gone blind with age, by just causing these sort of growth factors to be upregulated and the epigenetic clocks to reset. And by doing so, they have all of these positive features. And so now, not to get too sci-fi, but the idea is that we might be reaching what we call this longevity escape velocity, where our ability to turn back the clock is actually outpacing our aging rate. And so we might be able to live for very long periods of time.
It's amazing. I always tell our clients that I think that the world is going to become a world of health, have and have nots. And, some of that can be driven by economics. But in general, I think with the research and the data out there, we can now start to make smart lifestyle choices that are going to dramatically improve our health. And if we live the right way, we'll have a level of health beyond what anyone could have comprehended. And then there are people that make the wrong choices that are obviously going to be in poor health and on medications for a big part of their lives.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think a lot of that goes to knowledge, right? If you know what to do, if you can make the changes, it also doesn't necessarily have to be expensive. There are things you can do, but you just have to know what to do. And tools like this are what allow you to be able to make those decisions. But with that being said, we even actually see that things like socioeconomic class and the amount of adverse childhood experiences can change that rate of aging. So I would totally agree with you that it's going that direction. But having the knowledge to be able to try and fix those solutions can really put you into that, the haves, essentially, to give you the necessary power to make the changes you need.
Absolutely. One of the products that's sort of hot in the anti-aging space is NAD plus and NMN. So do you see usage of those products helping from an anti-aging perspective as well?
Yeah, so we haven't done, I would say, controlled studies. So it's a little bit hard to say definitively. But I would say that in our data set, we do see a positive trend. But we really, I would say it's a pretty unscientific way to look at it because we don't know which product's better. We don't know, what level is best. But we do know,
Right.
obviously, that NAD decline over age is one of the things that leads to worse outcomes. And this is pretty well established. And we know that, NAD interventions like nicotinamide riboside or NMN tend to improve some of those outcomes. And so I think that even from a functional perspective, we know that it's probably something you should consider. And it leads to a lot of those hallmarks of aging that we talked about. NAD is something that can activate these sirtuin enzymes, which are really important as it relates to DNA repair and maintenance, making sure we don't have a lot of those mutations in our DNA. And so I don't necessarily think it's something that I wouldn't recommend at the moment, but we're still waiting on more data to make recommendations there.
Right, okay. Another product that I've read a lot about recently is Rapamycin. Do you have any thoughts on Rapamycin in terms of product, overall thoughts? I know you used to be at TaylorMade in the past, so.
I absolutely love rapamycin, and rapamycin is probably one of the drugs I'm most hopeful for to be applied now to really slow the aging process. In almost every animal study, it has on average, upwards of a 6% increase in total lifespan, which is pretty incredible with just one single intervention. I also tend to think that one of the theories about why rapamycin works is called this hyperfunction theory of aging, which is really complicated, but essentially what it shows is that the earlier you start rapamycin, generally the better it is for long-term outcomes. And so I think there's really no reason that people shouldn't be implementing rapamycin as a treatment for anti-aging. I think it is something that is sustainable and one of the best therapies on our radar at the moment.
Great. Yeah, like I said, I've been researching it. I've read a lot of positive articles on it. I listened to a lot of lectures. I think Huberman did a big podcast on it. So I think it's a really interesting product.
Definitely. And Brian, I'm so sorry, but I might have to run for another call. Is that okay? Have we gotten everything?
Yeah. Listen, I think that was the end of the question, so we're all set.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the time. If there's anything you need from me, just let me know.
Perfect. Listen, thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you on another one.
Sounds great. Yeah, we'll do a report review. Thanks, Brian.
All right, Ryan, take care.